Welcome to GEOhistory Files. Here, history isn't just remembered, it's investigated. Every empire, every war, and every political decision leaves a legacy that still shapes our world today. If you're new here, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. Now, let's uncover the story they never wanted you to know. What really caused World War II, 1918 to 1939? There is a version of history in which the Second World War begins in 1939. Tanks crossing into Poland, cities darkened, the sky filling with engines. But that is only the moment the fire became visible. The truth is older, slower. It was written into the peace itself, into the very documents meant to end all wars. The War of 1939 was not born in 1939. It was assembled piece by piece over 21 years by men who believed they were building something permanent. This is the story of how a peace became a countdown. In the final autumn of 1918, the old world was already dead. 4 empires that had stood for centuries were dissolving at once. The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, the Russian Empire. Each had entered the war as a great power. Each left it as ruins or memory or something waiting to be renamed. Across Europe, the machinery of order had simply stopped. Governments fell in weeks. Borders that had existed for generations became suggestions. In Berlin, sailors mutinied and workers filled the streets. The Kaiser, who had ruled as though by divine arrangement, abdicated and fled to a small house in the Netherlands, where he would live out his years cutting logs and waiting for a call that never came. Something like 10 million soldiers were dead. 20 million more were wounded. An entire generation of young men had been fed into the ground of France and Belgium, and the survivors returned to countries that could no longer feed them. This was the void. Into a void, something always moves. The something in this case was a room. At the Palace of Versailles, the Great Hall of Mirrors, the victorious powers gathered to decide the shape of the future. There were representatives from nearly 30 nations. But the decisions belonged to a smaller circle. Georges Clemenceau of France, old and hard, who had watched Germany invade his country twice in his lifetime. Woodrow Wilson of the United States, an idealist who arrived with a vision of a world governed by principle. David Lloyd George of Britain, a pragmatist caught between the two. They did not agree on what they were building. Wilson wanted a peace that would prevent future wars, a peace of reconciliation, structured around a new organization called the League of Nations, where disputes would be settled by discussion rather than by armies. Clemenceau wanted something simpler. He wanted Germany broken so completely that it could never rise again. And Lloyd George wanted trade to resume, markets to reopen, and Britain's empire to remain undisturbed. What emerged from the compromise satisfied none of them, and this was its deepest flaw. The Treaty of Versailles was harsh enough to enrage Germany, but not harsh enough to destroy it. It punished without disabling. It humiliated without eliminating the capacity for revenge. Germany lost 13% of its territory and all of its colonies. Its army was capped at 100,000 men. It was forbidden tanks, submarines, and an air force. And in a single clause, Article 231, it was made to accept sole responsibility for the war, a legal foundation for reparations that would eventually total more than the entire German economy could bear. The Germans were not invited to negotiate. They were summoned to sign. The delegation that traveled to Versailles found a document already complete, presented as a verdict rather than an agreement. Their objections were noted and ignored, and when they returned home, they carried with them a phrase that would poison German politics for a generation. They called it the Diktat, the dictated peace. On the surface, the war was over. The treaties were signed. The League of Nations was founded. A structure of permanent peace appeared to stand across the continent, but this would not last. The trouble began with numbers that could not be paid. The reparations demanded of Germany were set, in 1921, at 132 billion gold marks. It was a figure so large it functioned less as a debt than as a sentence. Germany, already stripped of its industrial regions and colonies, was expected to transfer its wealth outward for decades. When it fell behind on payments in 1923, France responded by occupying the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heart, to extract the coal and steel by force. German workers answered with passive resistance. They stopped working. The government, to support them, printed money. What followed became one of the most infamous economic collapses in history. The German mark, which had traded at around 4 to the American dollar before the war, fell to 42,000 to the dollar by the autumn of 1922. By November of 1923, it took 4 trillion marks to buy a single dollar. Workers were paid twice a day and rushed to spend their wages before the afternoon erased their value. People burned banknotes for heat because the paper was worth more as fuel than as money. A lifetime of savings could vanish in a week. The economic damage was severe. The psychological damage was worse. An entire middle class, the shopkeepers, the teachers, the pensioners, the people who form the stable center of any society, watched their security evaporate through no fault of their own. They lost faith not only in money, but in the government that had failed to protect it. They lost faith in the republic itself. That republic, the Weimar Republic, had been born in defeat and would never escape its shadow. It was democratic, modern, and culturally brilliant. Berlin in the 1920s became one of the great creative capitals of the world. But beneath the surface, millions of Germans regarded the entire system as a foreign imposition, a government of the men who had signed the diktat, who had accepted the guilt, who had brought the humiliation. Into that resentment, a myth had already begun to spread. It held that Germany had never truly lost the war on the battlefield, that the army had been undefeated in the field and betrayed from within by politicians, by revolutionaries, by unseen enemies at home. It was called the stab in the back. It was false. It did not need to be true. It only needed to be believed. And among those who believed it and who learned to make others believe it was a failed artist and army veteran named Adolf Hitler. In 1923, at the height of the inflation, Hitler was an obscure agitator leading a small party in Munich. In November of that year, he attempted to seize power by force, marching through the streets in an amateur coup that collapsed almost immediately. 16 of his followers were killed. He was arrested and imprisoned. He served 9 months. In prison, he wrote a book laying out his beliefs, the racial hatreds, the vision of German expansion eastward, the enemies he intended to destroy. It sold poorly at first. Few took it seriously, and for a time it seemed they were right not to. Because as Hitler sat in his cell, Germany was beginning to recover. In 1924, an international plan restructured the reparations and brought American loans flowing into the German economy. The currency was stabilized, factories reopened, unemployment fell. For 5 years, the extremes of German politics receded, and the Republic entered what looked like a golden age. By 1928, in the last free elections before the storm, Hitler's party received less than 3% of the vote. The observer of that moment might reasonably have concluded that the danger had passed, that recovery had done what the treaty could not, and made the peace real at last. Yet the recovery rested on a foundation no one in Berlin controlled. The foundation was in New York, and in October of 1929, it gave way. The American stock market collapsed, and the collapse did not stay in America. The loans that had rebuilt Germany were called back. Credit vanished across the world at once. Trade contracted, prices fell. Factories that had reopened closed again, and this time they did not reopen. The Great Depression fell upon Germany with particular cruelty because Germany had built its recovery on borrowed money. By 1932, 6 million Germans were unemployed, nearly a third of the workforce. The recovery that had quieted the extremists was gone, and the desperation that had once fed them returned deeper than before. The people who had lost their savings in 1923 now lost their jobs in 1930. They had trusted the moderate parties, the Democratic Center, and had been ruined twice, and so they stopped trusting the center. They began to look toward the edges, toward anyone who spoke with certainty, who named an enemy, who promised not compromise, but deliverance. In the elections of 1930, the party that had received 3% 2 years earlier received 18. In July of 1932, it received 37, becoming the largest party in Germany. It had not won a majority. It had not seized power. But the democratic system, paralyzed and afraid, would hand power to it anyway. On the 30th of January, 1933, believing they could control him, The conservative elites of Germany appointed Adolf Hitler as chancellor. They were wrong about the control. They would be wrong about almost everything. What came next did not take years. It took weeks. In February, the German parliament building burned. The fire was blamed on a communist conspiracy, and within a day, emergency decrees suspended civil liberties across the country, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, protection from arrest. The instruments of the democratic state were turned against democracy itself. In March, under intimidation, and with opposition leaders already imprisoned or in hiding, the parliament passed a law granting Hitler the power to rule by decree. It was called the Enabling Act. With it, the Republic voted to end itself. Within a year, all other political parties were banned, trade unions were dissolved, the states were stripped of their autonomy, the courts, the press, the schools, the police, each was brought under a single authority. And when the old president died in the summer of 1934, Hitler merged the offices of president and chancellor into one and named himself Führer, leader of the German state. The consolidation was total and it was fast. A nation of 65 million people, one of the most educated and industrialized on earth, had been converted into a dictatorship in 18 months. The mechanism of it was not mysterious. Fear was manufactured, then offered a cure.
Yes, right away,
Enemies
sir.
were named, then blamed. And a population exhausted by a decade of humiliation and collapse was told that its suffering had a cause, a face, and a solution. Rearmament began almost immediately, in secret at first, then openly. The limits of Versailles, the 100,000-man army, the ban on tanks and aircraft were simply ignored. And the world that had written those limits watched and calculated and did nothing. The doing nothing had a logic, and it is worth understanding because it was not stupidity, it was memory. The nations of Western Europe had buried a generation in the last war. Britain and France had emerged victorious and hollow, their treasuries drained, their populations grieving, their appetite for conflict entirely gone. The very idea of another war on the scale of the first was, to the men who governed them, not a policy option, but a nightmare to be avoided at any cost. And so, as Germany rearmed, they told themselves stories. That Hitler's demands were reasonable, that he sought only to undo the injustices of Versailles, a treaty many in Britain now privately agreed had been too harsh. That once the wrongs were corrected, he would be satisfied. That a strong Germany might even serve as a barrier against the communist threat rising in the East. Each concession was defended as the one that would secure the peace. Each was followed by another demand. In 1935, Germany announced open rearmament and reintroduced conscription. The response was protest and nothing more. In 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, the demilitarized zone along the French border, in direct violation of the treaties. The German generals had orders to retreat if France resisted. France did not resist. The soldiers stayed. That was the moment, historians would later say, when the war might still have been stopped without a war. A single firm response when Germany was still weak might have ended the entire trajectory. It did not come. The lesson Hitler drew was clear and correct. The men across the border would not fight. He tested it again and again, and each test succeeded. In March of 1938, German troops crossed into Austria and annexed it entirely, a nation of nearly 7 million people, absorbed without a shot. The Union was celebrated in the streets of Vienna. The world objected on paper. Then came Czechoslovakia. Hitler demanded the Sudetenland, a border region with a large German-speaking population, claiming only the desire to unite his people. Czechoslovakia was prepared to fight. It had a capable army and strong border defenses, but it could not stand without allies, and its allies did not come. In September of 1938, at Munich, the leaders of Britain, France, Germany, and Italy met to decide the fate of a country whose representatives were not permitted in the room. They gave Hitler what he asked. The Sudetenland was handed over. Czechoslovakia was not consulted. It was informed. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, returned to London holding a signed paper and told the crowds that he had secured peace for their time. The relief was genuine. The crowds were enormous. For a moment, it seemed that reason had prevailed, that the endless concessions had finally purchased the peace they were meant to buy. But this would not last. It would not last 6 months. In March of 1939, German troops marched into what remained of Czechoslovakia and took the rest of it. There was no German-speaking population to justify it now. No injustice of Versailles to correct. The pretense was gone, and with it went the last illusion in London and Paris. The men who had believed in reasonable demands finally understood that there had never been a limit to the demands. There had only been a sequence, and each concession had made the next one easier. Appeasement had not prevented the war. It had fed the force that would begin it, and left that force stronger with every passing year. Britain and France now guaranteed the independence of Poland, which everyone understood to be the next target. But the guarantee came late, and it rested on an assumption that turned out to be false, that Germany would never risk a war on two fronts, that the vast and hostile Soviet Union to the east would always stand as a check against German ambition. Then in August of 1939, the last piece fell into place, and it stunned the world. The two most bitter enemies in Europe, Nazi Germany, which had built its entire ideology on the destruction of communism, and the Soviet Union, which regarded fascism as its mortal foe, signed a pact of non-aggression. They agreed not to fight one another. And in a secret section of the agreement, hidden from the public, they divided Eastern Europe between them, drawing a line through Poland before a single soldier had crossed its border. For Hitler, the pact removed the final obstacle. The two-front war that had destroyed Germany in the last conflict would not repeat. The East was secured, if only temporarily. Poland now stood alone, guaranteed by allies too far away to save it, and too weak to strike Germany directly. The countdown that had begun at Versailles reached its final seconds. On the 1st of September 1939 at dawn, German forces crossed into Poland along its entire western border. The attack came from the ground and from the air, faster and more coordinated than anything the world had seen. 2 days later, Britain and France, bound by their guarantee, declared war. The peace that had been signed in the Hall of Mirrors 20 years and 10 months earlier was over, and the war it had been designed to prevent had become the war it helped to cause. The men at Versailles had believed they were ending something. In truth, they were only pausing it. The pattern is visible now. From a distance the participants never had. A punishing peace that humiliated without disabling. A young democracy blamed for that peace and never trusted. An economic collapse that erased the middle and empowered the edges. A recovery that hid the danger, and a second collapse that revealed it. A dictator underestimated by everyone who might have stopped him. At each stage where stopping him would have been cheap. In a world so afraid of the last war that it walked, one reasonable step at a time, into a far greater one. None of it was inevitable in the way that a sunrise is inevitable. At a dozen moments, a different choice might have broken the chain. The Rhineland, Munich, the years of rearmament ignored. But each choice was made by people acting on fear, on memory, on the hope that the next concession would be the last. That is the quiet lesson buried in these 2 decades. Wars are rarely started by a single act of aggression. They are built slowly out of grievances left to fester, out of settlements too weak to hold and too harsh to accept, out of the human wish to believe that peace can be purchased by giving a little more. The fire of 1939 was visible to everyone. The kindling had been laid, patiently, in the years when no one was watching. And history, which forgets nothing and forgives nothing, was already preparing to lay it again.